Well, welcome to this gathering where we're going to engage, or where we have been engaging with Whitley Lectures from 1996 onwards. And we've got to the one from 2006 this evening, which is looking at, it's called Being Human, a Black British Christian Women's Perspective by Kate Coleman. And we're going to try and engage with it. There aren't as many because of something else going on that's just begun, which many people will be watching, and I think other people engage with. But the few are here, hopefully we're going to have a kind of rich conversation about this lecture for the next 55 minutes or so. So let me just give a couple of things from my engagement, and then hopefully we'll get into some conversation. So Kate Coleman gave this lecture when, at the same time that she was appointed as Baptist Union President in 2006. So she had the double honor of being president and delivering the Whitley Lecture. What an honor that was. And I guess this was because my reflections, Kate was becoming a voice in the union at that point. She was one of very few, if not only, perhaps only the one Black Baptist woman minister at the time. And I guess there was this attempt of trying to listen to her voice and in the appointment of president and giving this Whitley Lecture. The Whitley Lecture that she writes comes out of her bigger work of a PhD that she had just finished, I think, around about that time at the University of Birmingham. And so there's, she says at the beginning that she's drawing some ideas out of that in this lecture. I think another quick reflection is the lecture comes almost 9 years on from Ruth Goldman reflecting on women in ministry from her own context. And I think probably about another 4 years later, Anne Clements will offer a lecture, which is another woman reading scripture. And so I guess, you know, this is, we hear it in that kind of wider context, both Ruth and Anne being white Baptist women, but there's something of this sense of Baptists reflecting on ministry and being women within that, and scripture as well. This, I think, me reading it, and it'd be interesting to the friend, this is a very academic lecture, not to say that others weren't, but it's full of ideas that are not always straightforward to grasp, and you have to read it very carefully. I'm not sure if I always understood it, which I think is both a strength and a weakness, because we want it, I think the Whitley Lectures should be academic, and they should reach that kind of level of thought. A weakness, though, maybe, is that perhaps some of what Kate is trying to express wasn't particularly heard at the time, and perhaps may still be something that we don't hear perhaps as well, because we haven't got the translation work, something going on. And I think for me reading it, and I don't know if I'd read it, I think I probably had read it before, but this kind of reading a little bit more thing, is to enter this lecture is almost to enter into a different world. And Kate kind of makes the argument that I guess most theology that most of us are reading is what she calls Eurocentric. And so to read this lecture is to come across a whole range of other voices, many of them being feminist, womanist voices, that at least back in 2006, I would imagine that most Baptists wouldn't have heard of. And here in 2024, perhaps still many of them Baptists would have never heard of and engaged with. And so there's something about entering this Whitley Lecture. For me, it was like entering into a different kind of conversation and a different way of doing theology than the one that I'm normally in, which I think is something refreshing, but it also, again, makes some of that work slightly hard because we're trying to do translation work. Something that, you know, I guess Kate calls the lecture Being Human, and then she quotes quite near the beginning from Wilkinson when she says, "The deepest feminist cry has been not I want to have power, but I want to be human." And that kind of, for me, captures something of what this lecture was about as I received it and heard it. This sense of actually wanting to make sure that as Black womanist voices, Christian voices, there's that sense of being human and being heard. Kate draws attention to her social condition and wanting to say actually all theology has a social condition about it. But again, most Eurocentric theology hasn't, although I would probably say actually 10 years on, nearly 20 years on from this lecture, we are much more aware of social context. And, you know, I'm thinking of the stuff that SCM are publishing these days, very much is aware of social context. But again, perhaps it wasn't as much when this lecture was first given. And her social context is as a Black British Christian woman. And in hearing that, and I guess for her, some of that is actually that most womanist theology has been done by Americans primarily. And so here she is as a British woman seeking to do some of that from her perspective. And again, she's doing some translation work, it seems to me, at times. The thrust of the lecture seems to me is around epistemology and how do we know? How do we know what it means to be made in the image of God is one of the questions that it's asking. And here, I think Kate wants to say, actually, there are different ways of knowing. And part of what this lecture is to open up and offer a different way of knowing, again, that we might, different to what we might receive from, again, what she calls this Eurocentric theology. Something which is more experiential, much more in terms of lived experience, much more relational, was some of what I was picking up from that. And she takes that Hebrew word yada, I don't know if I've said that right, as this kind of knowing that's not anti-intellectual, but it's more than just the intellect. It's a kind of relational, engaging, responsive kind of knowing against what she calls an abstract. So part of, again, the thrust of the lecture is to bring scripture into that and a rereading of Genesis 1 to 3 and how we might reread that and hear that in different ways. And then on page 55, and this is where I guess I want to finish before, and others will perhaps draw attention to other things, but this just jumped out at me. Bottom of the page, if you've got it in front of you. A theology that fails to call for change in the socio-political realities of the marginalized, such as Black British women, or fails to attend to the issues of freedom from oppressions, equality, and recognition as fully accepted participants in British life, is at best inadequate and at worst demonic. I guess that jumped out at me. It jumped out at me because that kind of fails to call for change. Some of us many of us in the school will be aware of Project Violet and its request for change. And perhaps there are some overlapping in what Kate is talking about here with that Project Violet is doing, which I thought was interesting. And I guess, are we in that place where we are doing theology in such a way that Kate is talking about there? Are we hearing it? Are we responding with it? So that was my kind of brief kind of things that were jumping out at me as I read this lecture. Again, as I said, I found it a difficult one, but I think there's something rich here that we need to hear and listen carefully to. What did you make of it? Sally?
Yeah, I agree with the idea of complexity and freshness that you've just identified. And yet, when I read this, I thought, I remember Kate doing this lecture, but I don't remember hearing it in 2006. I don't know why not, but I don't remember listening to it. So reading it pretty much from fresh, I really wondered, I wish she was here because I would love to ask her whether she feels that since Black Lives Matter, some of these issues are more mainstream. Because I certainly feel that with the pressure to decolonialise the agenda in higher education, some of the concepts that Kate describes are more familiar to us. So the sort of critique of, particularly as theology as white, masculine, Eurocentric theology that's very cerebral, that seems to me to be well on the way to becoming a mainstream approach. And I suppose my question would be, are we throwing anything away that's also important in that journey? How do we strike a happy balance between embracing this new perspective and also holding on to those elements of the Western tradition that are truly rich, important, helpful to us because in the end, I suppose we do live in the West, although an increasingly differentiated version of the West. So I think those are the things I'd love to ask Kate if she was here, and I'd be interested to know what the people think about whether her ideas are more mainstream now. Yeah.
I think for me that's another thing which I didn't note down, but I guess reading it also felt some resonances with Willie James Jennings' After Whiteness.
Definitely.
That we're in the same kind of, he's doing something slightly different, but that we're in the same kind of, I was going to say ballpark, or the same kind of thing. But I think you're immediately right, Sally. This is just a different way of doing theology. And for most of us who have been brought up in the kind of Western tradition, you know, it's hard for me anyway, at least I can only talk about myself. It's hard for me to get completely into what a womanist Black approach to doing theology is, and I think that's the challenge to us who are brought up in the Western tradition. I'm not sure I want to completely get rid of the Western tradition, because I think there is something valuable in that, but yes.
Do you know, the thing in the Willie Jennings things that really made me sort of stop in my tracks was when he says he critiques all of higher education, doesn't he? It's sort of predicated on the white male power model, but then he sort of isolates theological education and says, well, this is worse because men are imago Dei. It just adds like gunpowder to the whole thing. And I suddenly thought, I really need to think about this very hard. But I think that's interesting, because when Kate talks about the imago Dei as this much more holistic thing, you know, not the sort of abstracted ways that we often end up thinking about it. I thought, yeah, that is really interesting. And yeah, if we start to think about the way we know things in this different way, that's absolutely fascinating and really challenging. And it kind of, because the critique of practical theology is often that it starts with experience and it isn't sufficiently theological or biblical, isn't it? And I kind of think, you know, so if you start from this perspective, that's really interesting in terms of doing practical theology.
Yeah.
I'm going to say I'm just very aware of my whiteness when reading this, which is always a healthy place to be. But I think one of the things I was interested in is kind of her essentializing of Blackness. And she talked about the idea that all kind of the kind of that there is something of an essentialized experience, because both that Black people have both of oppression and having lived through oppression and having that history, but also of a kind of pre-oppression that still resonates and is still part of kind of the spirituality. And I was really interested by that, and kind of fascinated really, and again wondering how diverse that is, and now and how generational that might be as a thought. I think again, I think of her age, I think she would fit in within a kind of feminist womanist theology that would have essentialized womanhood in general as well. So white feminism did, and that was critiqued by womanism. So I'm just kind of I'm sort of fascinated by that as an idea as well, and not feeling able to.
Can you remember what that was, Beth?
Where it was?
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find it. I was just trying to find it. I remember just picking up on it as a.
Yeah, it rings a bell. Sorry.
No, it's all right. I'll try and find it. I think it's quite early on. Let me see. I'm trying to. It's the problem with having it on your phone, isn't it? You haven't got like. I'd have highlighted it several times over otherwise. Let me see if I can find it and I'll come back to you, but carry on talking. But yeah, I was just interested because I felt I can't reply to that as somebody who hasn't that lived experience. But I was really interested by it. I wonder if there is an essentialized whiteness as well, and I think perhaps there is, and I don't know it because I'm white and therefore I don't have to be aware of it. Oh yeah, let me see if I can find this. Maybe I've read it in. There's always the fear now, isn't it? I don't think I did.
No, I'm kind of regretting that. In a fit of enthusiasm, I read this, I think, like the morning after our last meeting, and now I'm regretting having done so because it's been too many weeks since I've read it, and it's not quite as fresh in my mind as I wish it was. But it's interesting you were saying, Andy, about things being kind of to what extent things here that were pretty, fresh and new and unusual when the lecture was given have become mainstream. And to some extent, certainly the themes, but then I noticed one of the things that struck me was referencing Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy in this essay, and they're people who I've heard the names over the years, but I've only really this year kind of discovered their writing, and I've been kind of like amazed at the fact that it hasn't kind of forced itself on me before, and because I've found them both like really, really fascinating and thought-provoking writers. So part of me was kind of wishing that I'd heard this all those years ago and been inspired to kind of seek out Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall.
Yeah. And I guess part of that seems to me that the decolonizing the curriculum and things like that is the fact that actually most of our curriculum would have been in a particular set of texts, which personally I don't think are bad texts. But and when I read this and I read other work, Willie James Jennings and others, I suddenly realize though that my knowledge of theology is so small, and actually to have a handle on the whole breadth of perspectives and engagements and ways of doing theology is probably, well, it's beyond me. But actually how important it is when we're doing our own theology, but also perhaps trying to pass theology on to a new generation, is to make sure that we at least help people see that breadth and those ways of doing it. I think my comment, just picking up on that, is I think Kate remains a fairly rare voice within Baptist and perhaps even in at least evangelical Christian circles as being a womanist, British womanist kind of voice. There aren't many of those in amongst us as Baptists, and I think probably within the evangelical world as well. And so that there's a sense of, I think some of what Kate is talking about is become more mainstream, but Black women voices are still fairly rare, I think, in the UK, being heard and doing theology. We might know that Kate has kind of taken a different perspective. She hasn't gone really, I think it's fair to say, she hasn't gone an academic route. She's gone down a route of kind of encouraging, inspiring, and shaping women in leadership. So it'd be interesting. I don't know if we've got any more of her womanist theology, unless it's expressed in those kind of places around that, which I think, for me, I feel it would have been just fascinating if she'd been able to find some time in amongst all the other things that she's doing to continue some of what she's unpacking there in the PhD. Yeah. Beth, have you found it?
I found it. So she quotes Patricia Hill Collins, who asserts that, and actually, to be fair, she nuances this quite a lot. So
Page 14?
Page 14, she quotes Collins, and actually she uses Gilroy, so to reference you in there, as providing a critique and the challenge of her tendency to overstate the internal coherence of the experience of Black women, ultimately constructing a global Black woman. So actually he's stressing the complexity and plasticity of the Black Atlantic populations. So to be fair, she does seem to kind of critique that as she goes, or offers critique of that as she goes. I'm not sure I know where she quite ends up on that, other than it's there are epistemological frameworks, but I'm not sure if she says where she quite lands on how she understands that.
I think she does that in several places, really. She kind of offers us this breadth of different views without perhaps, landing completely in one place. Which again, I think reminds me that even when we're talking about womanist theology, we need to be talking about womanist theologies. There is no black theology, there's black theology. In the same way, there is no white theology, there's only white theology, there's only Baptist theologies, and I guess the way that, again, we engage in theology is we kind of try and create that global perspective. And part of what Kate reminds us here is that there is no global perspective. There's only, the theology that we do from our own social context, which can relate and respond to other theologies, but it will have its own particularity, I guess. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I think I'm trying to work out when I started theology, whether I think I was I introduced as this was becoming more of a reference, womanism particularly, and kind of the critiques of white feminism were kind of particularly kind of brought out, and there was just an increasing sense of post-colonial. So I did a post-colonial kind of doctrine thing in my very first term. We had Professor Aguilar give us this class on that. So I think my very first term of theology at St Andrews, I got introduced to the idea that we should be aware that most of what we were about to be discussing for the next 4 years was going to be white and Western. Now, it was still most of what we were discussing for the next 4 years was white and Western and male. But I was really grateful for that introduction, because I think at least it kind of planted a seed of something in there, even if it didn't expose me too much beyond that particular class. And I kind of thinking on beyond that module, I don't think there was anything available. But and I'm not sure, looking at Regents, there was some on the MTH, to be fair. Actually, the MTH was pretty good for trying to do global theologies a lot more. Kathy Ross and others trying to point out, I think, kind of contextuality. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is I think contextuality and particularity was kind of felt like a given a bit more, whilst also operating within a dominant kind of, you've got to know your Barton Bonhoeffer. Patristics didn't enter into St Andrews because we're very reformed. So as long as you could quote your Calvin, you were good to go. But so I think I was interested by how much that is, how much that's changed gradually, or maybe it's changed place by place, I don't know. And whether you do need those people who've read those things to then bring it into the classroom environment and form us, I don't know.
We had an interesting lecture from, Selina Scott, who's on the Durham, well, she was at Durham and she's moved up to one of the Scottish universities now, hasn't she? Yeah. But it was an interesting lecture on post-colonial agenda, and I suddenly started thinking about the marking criteria that we use, because we were talking about ways that we could decolonize the curriculum, and we were talking about reading lists and the images we use and all the usual sort of things. But I suddenly started thinking about the marking criteria and how African heritage students have struggled so much with criticality as a category for as a concept that they have to get their heads around. And I just thought how we'd really have to chuck out those kinds of marking criteria altogether and completely revolutionize the way that we evaluate the content of essays to do this, a thorough job on this. And it actually got quite scary the more you sort of looked at what lay behind what we're evaluating. You realise how deeply entrenched it is in the things that we just take for granted. It was quite an interesting exercise to think about that.
Yeah, I guess I struggle with some of whether that, I don't think that's all inappropriate. I think the ways that, I guess I might have a slight, it'd be interesting again if Kate was in the conversation, and or I think someone like Anthony Reddy was in our conversation as well. I don't think all the marking criteria for me is bad. I guess what I think might be appropriate and would be good is actually there are also other things. There might be particular pieces of work that would have a different marking criteria. So actually, you're equipping the student to be able to engage in one discourse, but also also equip them into other discourses. You know, one which I guess would be much more around lived experience and reflecting on that and social context. And that for me would be appropriate. But and I think this is the challenge that's going on. I think especially if you're involved in the Durham Awards, but perhaps also for all institutions.
Yes, because I was thinking when we vary an assignment, for instance, for somebody who's got severe dyslexia and can't actually write an essay or something, we vary the mode or the form, but we're still looking. They may do it verbally, they may do a presentation, but we're still looking for criticality and structure of the argument and all that sort of thing when it comes down to it. And I just thought that's a really interesting challenge to sort of really dig away at that and say, you know, where do we need to do that and where don't we need to do that? And, you know, that is just quite interesting because it's so embedded all the way through what we do. It would be a real task to change it, but it should be reflected on without a doubt.
I'm just reading her understanding of knowledge again, and trying to remember it well from when I read it earlier. But yeah, I wonder if it's something closer to the, you know, for those of you who've been in a Regents assessed service, you'll know what I mean. But there's always the feedback form at the end, and it asks questions like, but what was the good news? And it's changed slightly over the years, but it's pretty much the feedback form I remember being kind of inflicted with as well. And actually there's a sense of it being peer assessed, which is still a criticality, but that they are the community who know you, who pray with you, who live with the kind of ins and outs of your church situations week in, week out, who will know your theological take in a classroom, who will then also see you like lead worship and preach. And I think therefore you've got to write a feedback form, one would hope, in such a way that you can continue being in relationship with one another, because you actually still need to, you know, carry on as a community at the end of this. And actually to the point where we discover as tutors quite often that there is a very distinct lack of criticality, because nobody wants to upset their friends and say, well, that bit was rubbish. And so the kind of one of the ways I try and get the students to think about it is hearing things multiply is helpful, because actually if a lot of people heard the same thing, then that might show you what's heard from what you've said, even if it's not what you intended to say, or it might be really reassuring that what you intended to say is what was heard. But the kind of, I think there's an interesting thing there, isn't there? Kind of, I wonder if it's more like the kind of sense of knowing, if you were to put it into kind of ministerial formation context, is much more in the sense of is it a kind of a peer discussion of these are the themes we've heard, this is the way we heard you, these were the bits that made me feel uncomfortable, these were the bits that made me feel liberated, and I wonder if it was more something about that this is what I heard being the good news in this, and actually you need to hear my perspective as somebody in the community who heard you, and this is what I heard, and that therefore my voice will matter. And I think it's, I don't know, I wonder if that would be more of a closer to, you know, a mock scheme that might be liberated from kind of whiteness. I don't know, but yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how that works.
And this, I think this probably points to the uniqueness perhaps of this lecture out of all the Whitley lectures that have been given so far, that it begins a different kind of conversation. You know, we've had very few black voices give the Whitley lecture. But this is a black woman voice as well, which I think is, you know, it is completely unique so far on the Whitley lecture. And just revisit, you know, we're revisiting. That's part of what this series is. It just reminds us of that. I think, you know, if this lecture was given this year, I think it still would have if I'm really honest, would have still struggled to land in lots of places.
Oh, okay. I was thinking it was really timely. So actually, I was thinking it's just as relevant as it was in 2006, which is a shame in some ways. I want it to be like old hat by now, because of course we've taken it on and we've thought about it and wrestled with it. But at the same time, I was just thinking, this is such a dense and brilliant and thoughtful piece of work that actually it seems like it hasn't timed out. Like, yeah.
Well, I think in fairness, having all the lectures that we've revisited all still feel very, very timely. Partly because I don't think we ever properly engage with the Whitley lecture when it's given. We're on to the next thing, and it's kind of time where it just hits a limited voice. But yes, I think there is something. We're in a place of thinking about education now, and a ways of doing theology, which probably we were not doing in the 2000s when this lecture was given. And that, I think that is the impact of Willie James Jennings and After Whiteness, but also I think other voices. Which, yes, I think, some of us in the Baptist colleges are about to, when we meet in September, we'll be engaging with Project Violet. And I think part of that will be thinking about ways that we do theology and the voices that we hear. And yeah. I guess part of the challenge of the lecture is, and I'm thinking of a couple of people I know, at least on the call, is where does this land for the person in the pew? And I think for me, if there was one thing about the lecture, and sometimes the lecture that was delivered is different from the lecture that is written. I think this lecture struggles to land in a way that perhaps means it doesn't get heard within the local Baptist congregation. And for me, that's not unique. I think some other Whitley lectures do the same thing. But yeah, so Gareth, I wonder what you made of it.
Far too academically heavy for me to actually engage in it and understand the subtleties involved. My education is predominantly technical, and and don't follow the same themes as the rest of you, I realise. But this one was even more so than usual, shall we say. There were questions that I was hoping to have explained to me, but they didn't seem to come up. I wanted to know more about the author, but I didn't get it. There's not a lot of the actual author coming out in this. I understand the reasons why, because it's part of the PhD, and it comes from there. But I really wanted to find out, the thoughts behind a Black Christian woman or a feminist woman, coming out. But I didn't get it. I've read recently, I can't forget the name of the authors now, reading scripture through Western eyes, which did bring out a lot of little stories of the subtleties that people from different cultures do bring into education, religious education. And that one came over a lot stronger. This one didn't.
I think that's a point that Ruth Goldbaum made as well, didn't she, in her review in the BMJ, that Coleman kind of espouses that makes the point that it's kind of salutary that theologians would share their own personal stories and their own voices, and their motivation, I think, is the emphasis she gives it, but she doesn't do so herself here. And that set me
maybe there's something slightly different than from hearing Kate deliver it, though, to then reading it. It's almost actually to hear Kate deliver it, you would, some of that lived experience would just be there for you.
Do you think it would be safe for her? I mean, we're talking about a lone Black woman in ministry. I mean, what we critiqued of her is that she gathers ideas together, but doesn't seem to come down hard on a particular view. My remembering of her, I have read her PhD, and I'm sure she does. She's more like she's more obvious in where she lands on things. So it's interesting then if she's less here, it's because, is she concerned about being read as something of a stereotype at any point, as being an angry black woman, or being too forceful with an opinion? Or is her idea actually, is her aim not to kind of go, here am I, here's my experience, please listen to my experience and be changed by it, but much more, can I just introduce you to a whole way of thinking that you've never had before, and here are some ideas that you may have never engaged with that you need to meet. I wonder if it's more of that.
I
Well,
got a funny sense that part of what was being delivered seemed to be saying, you know, British black feminist good, Eurocentric male bad.
I think there is something of that in there, which I think, as a white Eurocentric man, I would want to nuance. But I think, again, part of, I think, our problem of reading this lecture for me is probably because I'm so imbibed in that Eurocentric way of doing theology that I can't get my head around it. And I think that opens up, I think, not a problem that, you know, with what Kate offers, but it's a problem with me and the tradition that I guess I represent, unable to kind of think itself out of that to properly engage. And I think you're right, Beth, as a lone voice, you know, again, so Kate gives this lecture and then we're on to, you know, something complete. You know, the year before was on missionary theology from a white, you know, white male voice. The lecture after was on to interpretation from a covenant perspective, a white male voice. You know, it's not as though Kate was the beginning of a number of voices, which perhaps would have pulled us into to take more seriously what she's trying to offer and here present. Yeah. Valerie, did you want to say something?
When you're talking about I mean, I was reading this through and I'm finding Ruth Goldborn's more nuanced take on it quite helpful, because when you're talking about how it lands with a person in the pew, and the last speaker was talking about that white male Eurocentric bad kind of thing, and I do feel, as an unreconstituted old white British battle axe, that I have a problem with this in some way, because it's kind of that there is supposed to be a good and special theology. It's one thing hearing from someone who's got a black take on it, but you know, it's that in actual fact we're going to make a completely separate theology instead of integrating it into what we've already had. And I would like to hear from a black student, married lady or something, who has the problems of, you know, what you've got here is you've got a leader, actually, and a very good speaker and a communicator and an academic. But as you say, I'm not quite sure how this lands with the person in the pew. And I do find that there is an implicit criticism of everything that I have understood as theology. And it's not, and I feel that this is rather, it's like a kind of strident demand for reparations. Now, that's not always in the church, but it is an implied criticism. And I'm thinking, well, that's not quite where theology lands with me as a lady in the pew. Because everybody could want reparations for all sorts of things, and you can't rewrite history.
There's something that what did she talk about? She highlights what she calls on page 37 differentiation, distinctiveness, and diversity. And I think that stands. I guess part of what the lecture is, and it's called Being Human, is wanting to make space for that womanist perspective that Kate is wanting to bring as a British Christian, which I guess back in 2006 and still today was a rare voice. And so it has to, I think, probably articulate itself in a way that, Beth, you're absolutely, I think what you said, it's a lone voice. And it's going to be heard in ways that actually are deeply uncomfortable for those of us in the white Eurocentric tradition, because it's trying to be heard in a way that hasn't been heard and struggles to be heard. I think it probably reflects that often we look at the race conversation in the States and think, oh my goodness, that is, aren't we glad that we're British and the race conversation isn't as bad as in America? That for me is a view that sometimes I guess I have myself thinking, but actually, I think we really struggle. What this lecture and probably Black theology in its place within Baptist life, if not theological life, is that we still struggle to talk about race. And it's much more subtle within a British context than it is in America, but it's there. And for us as white people, it's uncomfortable.
I think
yes, I get that, but I mean, I think it's you mentioned the Project Violet.
Yeah.
And I was surprised that the Project Violet only contains one or maybe a couple of pieces of work which suggest what could go forwards further. There's an awful lot of there about things that we don't like. And that's valid, but there's not a great deal of things of that actually. How can we build on the past and integrate ourselves rather than identifying ourselves either as a stupid old white woman or black lady theology? It's kind of defining ourselves by what we are as kind of groups, and I don't think that's very inclusive.
I guess part of, Beth, you come in or Sally as well, maybe. I guess my response to that in terms of Project Violet is I don't think the project's over. And what it's done so far is name some things to which I think, yeah, absolutely, more positive things, I guess, are prayed for and hoped for and worked out from. But the project's only got, I think the danger is actually because it's now released its results and we'll respond to it, we feel the project's over. I think probably we're in phase one of a much longer project, which to properly engage with these things. And I guess partly it feels to me so often we don't properly engage with things. We hear it, we move on, and we're on to the next conversation. And I guess my hope with Project Violet, as well as other things, is that we take the time to properly engage with it and work it out. But Beth, I don't know if you want to, or Sally, as those who've sat at least within and around Project Violet.
I mean, I think I think I want to talk about Black Lives Matter again, and I think that perhaps there has to be the naming of the horror before you can really move past it. I'm not quite sure what I'm trying, but it seemed to me that when the world saw George Floyd being suffocated on television, somehow something sank in that had never sunk in before, hideous though it was. And since then we have seen significant change, which was very slow beforehand. And I wonder if there is something about, almost naming the crucifixion, if you like, that allows resurrection to follow. And maybe with all of these things, we don't know how long Holy Saturday is going to be, but there is a Holy Saturday and then there's a resurrection and things start to turn around. But I mean, I was thinking as well of, I've got a Black colleague who comes in and teaches a session on Black anthropology on a module that I've been running. And he talks about the transatlantic slave trade and the conditions. And mostly there's a good number of people in the class who have never heard that before. And it's completely revolutionary for them to hear that. And it helps them to understand a lot of things that perhaps before they thought were just less significant than they do afterwards. So I'm not quite sure really what I'm grasping after something, but I think that's just what I've noticed.
Mm-hmm.
I remember first reading some womanist theology and this kind of what Kate names about kind of particularity, and reading from kind of a place of not having been privileged and feeling very critiqued and very attacked. And I was sort of sitting, I was doing my MTH, so I was in Bodleian and I was reading, I think it might have been Dolores Williams, I can't remember, and just being kind of completely thrown, partly because it was whatever I was reading was academically challenging, but also just because I felt really personally confronted by it. I'm a woman, I have a great, I was writing about women's experience. I was like, I also don't have a great experience of this. So, kind of, and it felt very like, why am I being attacked as the white feminist? Why am I being critiqued? And I was really cross about it. And I was. And so I cycled up the road, 1.5 miles to the church I was at that point the associate minister of. No, I just become the minister of. I was chairing a deacons meeting and we were discussing doing a Bible study. Now, the church was a very diverse church and really, really multicultural, in that probably 45% of the community were kind of Afro-Caribbean heritage, and then probably another 35% Portuguese, Brazilian speaking. So kind of you've got this kind of, and then everybody else from everywhere else, so Americans and anybody. And then people living, white British people who live in county their entire lives. So you've got this whole blend of everybody. It was a real fascinating church, and a very Windrush generation church. And in this conversation, we were talking about, could we do this Bible study more than one language, which I thought was like, get me and my inclusivity. And like, how do we do, like, could we kind of offer it in multiple languages? And is there a way of doing this? Is there any way this won't be complete chaos? And somebody pointed out that won't work for the people that can't read. And I was like, what do you mean the people can't read? And the deacon, and I'll love her forever for pointing this out to me, fabulous, kind of extremely like, she was like, if I describe her as like a proper black auntie, she was immaculate. She wore her gloves to deacons meetings and she was just phenomenal, held that church together with super glue. And she just pointed out to me, like naive young minister that I was, that, have you not noticed? And she named some names. Don't sign the cards when they come round. The people will sign them for them next to them. They literally couldn't write their name. And because there was a whole community of people who, for a variety of reasons, education had completely failed, whether that had been overseas or within the UK, and their experience of oppression, their experience of life had meant that they had actually never had access to enough education to be able to write their own name in a card. And that these are women I've been asking to read. And they did read because they memorized the scripture that they then read in front of church. Did it so beautifully, I never noticed. So there was me as a minister of this church for about 6 months, pretty brand new into the community, but had this moment of like absolute like brought up against my privilege. So having been reading about this stuff about white privilege and white feminism and and I suddenly had this experience, like this recognition of just what I had as a power. And it was such a healthy, and it was literally because the things happened probably within 2 hours. For me, it was a really holy ground moment, because like I absolutely turned my worldview inside out, and it made me think how much power I have. I'm at Oxford University doing a degree in one of the most ancient libraries in the entire world, worrying because I don't quite understand reading something on a piece of paper that's really academically dense, whilst I've got a community of people here who actually, like, I mean, the horror stories have then proceeded to tell me pastorally over the next 4 years were just they just formed into me something of like recognizing that, where I often feel like, oh, but there's still so much to do for me, that actually, and people like me, actually there's a recognition that actually maybe I need to sit back from some of that and go last sometimes. And actually maybe I need to take myself out of a space so somebody else can have that space. And what does it mean to be asking those sorts of questions about who's at the table? And I just, for me, it was I don't get it right at all now, but for me that was my encounter of my own whiteness in a very profound way. And I think it is really uncomfortable, and I think because like suddenly it's like, but what? And so it is a confrontation, I would say. And I think but then I've also, and when I, so another story, and I promise to shut up, sorry, get a preacher talking, she don't stop. But I had a horrible crippling postnatal depression, right, really crippling postnatal depression. And when I started reading again, and it took me a long time to be able to read, I ended up reading a load of womanist theology on salvation, because they were the only people who'd written about motherhood in a way that ever felt vaguely resonant to the thing I was going through. And they were talking about what salvation might be in a context where you might not be liberated, and this idea that salvation was not about kind of sacrifice, which is often how we name salvation, but this idea that salvation was maybe about seeking health and wholeness, and there was something much more about there's a different perspective within scripture, within the tradition, that we've kind of ignored because there's a love of sacrificial ego, where actually we need to be kind of moving towards kind of relationality and salvation as kind of being held by one another, by being loved into wholeness again. And that for me was also fundamentally life-changing experience of theology. So I think for me it was really interesting both to have the confrontation of it, but when actually I was in experience of having been very broken by life as it was, to have this experience of also being, that was the place I found resonance and I was so grateful for. So I think it's interesting, isn't it? They kind of both can happen. So, but I do think, to feel the kind of like, oof, is actually part of it, and I expect that does make it hard to land in a pew, especially depending on who's in your pews. I mean, it wouldn't have landed hard in my pews, John Bunyan. It would have been really like, yeah, this is us, this is our lives, this is how it's been. I think apart from the fact that it was so beautifully academically written, and I think that would have been the challenge there, but yeah.
But it's very, that power and privilege you talked about is highly contextualized in itself, isn't it? So if you think about going to a non-literary culture, who cares if you can write your name? Do you know what I mean? So it really is very, very localized, all of this stuff, isn't it? What we value, what we privilege, what we prioritize, and there's something about becoming aware of that that's also really important. I thought that was a fascinating anecdote. Thank you, Ben.
Ewan.
Yeah, can I just ask, a bit late in the game to be asking this, but the Whitley Lectures, I mean, I know that they're given at Regents because I've heard one at Regents, and I guess they're given at Spurgeon's too. Is it fair to judge a Whitley Lecture on the grounds of its being accessible or otherwise to the person in the pew? Are they specifically designed to be approachable, or are they for trained theologians?
They're supposed to be public lectures, and they're supposed to kind of give a platform to emerging Baptist scholars. So the Whitley series was reinvented about 30 years ago, maybe a bit more, and with the hope of encouraging people who were emerging in their theological career. So most people who write them are either finishing their PhD or they've just finished their PhD, and then the lecture would normally emerge from the PhD. But the hope is that it's a public lecture. So usually the actual delivered format of the lecture will be more accessible than the written form of the lecture.
And where do they?
And
they're given at all Baptist colleges, or they tried to be given at all Baptist colleges, and in the past, the Cates would have been given at the Baptist Assembly as well. It's not given at the Baptist Assembly anymore because it's too short and it doesn't make space for that kind of delivery, very sadly. But I guess in defence of the BU, they have attempted to do an online version, and I think the lecturer, I think the aim is that it will speak something to the whole of the Baptist life and world, and I guess my hope is I think some of the best lecturers have that in mind, and so have that kind of translation kind of work going on and seek to land somewhere. But and so is that going on? But bringing our conversation to a close, I think we've recognised again why Kate's Whitley lecture was very, very important, and perhaps wasn't. I don't know. It'd be interesting again for Kate to reflect back to us how it was received at the time, but actually how important it is to be read again today. And because I think it opens up a whole load of set of kind of conversations, some of which we've had this evening, about education, about knowledge, about listening to voices which are too rare, to about privilege, and that sense of blackness and whiteness. It's interesting that the Whitley lecture that's been given this year is opening up some of that again, but from the perspective of a white British male voice, wanting to acknowledge our whiteness. So yeah.
Did it come at the end of her? Was she the Baptist Union president?
She was at the same time. Yeah.
Did it come at the end? Yes, because around that time they were engaging in a thing called the Sam Sharp project, weren't they?
No, that was much later.
That's much later, right?
Well, when I say much later, that was another. So the apology that the Baptist Union Council made was in 2007. So that was a year later.
Yes.
The Sam Sharp project really began in about 2010, 2012.
11, yeah.
Yeah. So it's and I think probably it's some of what Kate does in this Whitley lecture and her voice in that time will have had that kind of impact, which had led us to those places. Yeah.
Gail Richards' doctorate is well worth a read if you want to read somebody else writing on this at the moment. She's just written her doctorate and it's fabulous. So
and I think, you know, Gail represents another voice, Black British Baptist voice coming into this conversation, but it also, I guess, shows the rareness of those voices, and hopefully Gail will find ways to
up on Kate, doesn't she, as well, and like her influence. So yeah.
And you know, hopefully Gail's work will find a place to be widely shared as well, that we might engage with it too.